Two of the men who wrote the Declaration of Independence died on the exact same day, 50 years later, both convinced the other was still alive. That is not a coincidence you learn in school. That is the kind of ending that gets quietly left out of the story, and it is only the beginning. Every single founding father had a death that got simplified, softened, or completely erased from the version of history you were handed. We are going through every one of them. You already know how Alexander Hamilton died, a bullet through the abdomen, fired by a sitting vice president, over an insult nobody even remembers anymore. It happened on a riverbank in New Jersey at dawn because dueling was already illegal in New York and both men needed somewhere quiet to kill each other legally. Hamilton had 11 children. He knew the odds. He stood there anyway. But here's what nobody tells you. Hamilton wasn't the only signer who died exactly like this. Button Gwinnett signed the Declaration of Independence knowing it could get him hanged for treason against the British Crown. He didn't blink. 6 months later, a man named Lachlan McIntosh called him a fool over a failed military operation, and Gwinnett challenged him to a duel over it. A grudge, not a cause, not a revolution. Just two men and their pride. They shot each other at 12 paces. Gwinnett took a bullet to the leg. It should have been survivable. It wasn't. The wound turned gangrenous, and 3 days later, one of the men who risked execution for founding a country was dead over an argument that history barely remembers the details of. He'd survived the one thing that could have gotten him legally killed. What actually got him was something so small it doesn't even have a real name in the history books. If a duel over pride could take down a man who faced down execution for treason without flinching, imagine what happens when the threat comes from inside your own family. If stories like this are the kind of thing you want to keep finding out, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribe now, because the next one on this list is worse. George Wythe taught Thomas Jefferson everything he knew about law. He wasn't just a signer, he was one of the most respected legal minds in the entire founding generation, the man other founders went to when they needed to understand what they were actually building. He survived the revolution. He survived decades on the bench as a judge. What he did not survive was his own family. In his final years, Wythe took in his great-nephew, a young man named George Sweeney, and gave him a place in his home and a place in his will. That should have been safe. It wasn't. Sweeney was drowning in gambling debts, and he knew exactly how much money was waiting for him the moment his great-uncle died. So one morning, he laced the household coffee with arsenic. Wythe drank it. So did a young black woman living in the household named Lydia Broadnax, and a teenage boy Wythe had recently freed and was mentoring. Both of them survived. Wythe did not. He lived long enough to know what had happened to him. He lived long enough to change his will and cut Sweeney out completely, disgusted at what his own blood had done. And then he died anyway, poisoned slowly over several agonizing days. Sweeney was arrested and put on trial for murder. Lydia Broadnax, the one person in that house who could describe exactly what she saw, was legally barred from testifying against a white man in a Virginia courtroom because of the color of her skin. Without her testimony, the case fell apart. George Sweeney walked out of that courtroom a free man. He inherited nothing because Wythe had already rewritten the will, but he also never spent a single day in prison for what he did. The man who helped write the laws of a new nation was killed by a legal loophole in the same system he helped build, and the only person who could have proven it happened wasn't even allowed to speak. Some founders weren't killed by people at all. Some of them were killed by money. Robert Morris put his own name on the line to keep the revolution alive. When the Continental Army had no money for supplies, no money for ammunition, no money to even feed the soldiers, it was Morris who used his personal credit and his own fortune to keep the whole thing running. Historians call him the financier of the revolution, because without him, there might not have been a country left to found. So what do you think happened to the man who saved the finances of an entire nation? He went broke, not metaphorically, completely, catastrophically broke. After the war, Morris poured what was left of his fortune into land speculation, buying up massive stretches of undeveloped territory, betting everything on the country he'd helped build continuing to grow. The bet failed. The land didn't sell. His debts piled up faster than he could pay them, and by 1798, the man who once personally bankrolled George Washington's army was arrested and thrown into debtor's prison. He spent 3.5 years locked up in the same country he had financially saved 20 years earlier. He was eventually released, but he never recovered his fortune or his standing. He died a few years later, quietly, in a small rented apartment, largely forgotten by the government he had kept alive. James Wilson, another signer and one of the original Supreme Court justices, made almost the exact same mistake. He also gambled everything on land speculation, and he also ended up buried in debt so deep that creditors chased him from state to state. He was actually jailed twice while sitting as a sitting Supreme Court justice, and he eventually died on the run, hiding out in a friend's house in North Carolina, still terrified of debt collectors finding him. Two of the men who built the financial backbone of the United States died broke, in hiding, chased by the exact kind of debt they had helped an entire nation survive. Two men who saved a nation's finances died, broke and forgotten. At least they got to see the war end. The next two men never did. Richard Stockton was a judge, a respected voice in New Jersey, and one of the men who put his name on the Declaration knowing exactly what the British would do if they ever caught him. In late 1776, they caught him. Loyalist sympathizers dragged him out of a friend's house in the middle of the night and handed him over to British forces. What happened next wasn't a quiet imprisonment. He was thrown into a common jail cell alongside criminals, deliberately starved and left out in the cold with no real shelter. British soldiers made an example of him specifically because he was a signer, someone they wanted other rebels to see broken. He was eventually released, but he never came back as the same man. The imprisonment had wrecked his health permanently. He developed cancer not long after, likely worsened by everything his body had endured in that cell, and it slowly killed him over the following years. He died in 1781, 2 years before the war he fought for was even officially over. Philip Livingston never even got that much. A wealthy merchant and signer from New York, he devoted enormous amounts of his personal fortune to funding the war effort, and he kept working for the cause even as his own health collapsed under the stress of it. In 1778, while attending Continental Congress business in York, Pennsylvania, far from his home and his family, he died suddenly. The war he had spent everything on had 5 more years left to run. He never got to see a single day of the country he helped build actually exist. Both men gave everything they had to a fight they never got to see the end of. Stockton and Livingston at least got graves. The next founder on this list didn't even get that. Thomas Lynch Jr. was 26 years old when he signed the Declaration of Independence, one of the youngest men in that room, with what should have been an entire lifetime ahead of him. Within 2 years, his health had collapsed so badly that doctors told him his only chance of survival was a complete change of climate. So in late 1779, he and his wife boarded a ship bound for the south of France, hoping the sea air and warmer weather might save him. The ship never arrived. It disappeared somewhere in the Atlantic, and to this day, nobody knows exactly what happened to it. No wreckage was ever confirmed, no bodies were ever recovered, no distress signal, no survivor account, nothing. One of the men who had signed away his life for a new country simply stopped existing somewhere between 2 continents, and the ocean never gave up the answer. There is no grave for Thomas Lynch Jr. There is no marked place where his story ends. Just an empty space in the historical record where a death should be, and a ship that sailed off the edge of what anyone actually knows. 51 more of these are still coming. If you don't want to miss how the rest of them go, hit subscribe before the next one, because it only gets stranger from here. If disappearing into the ocean sounds like the worst way to run out of time, imagine racing against your own death just to make it to a single vote. Caesar Rodney had cancer eating away at his face. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't something he could quietly manage in private. The tumor had grown so severe that he wore a green silk scarf wrapped across his features just to be seen in public without causing alarm. By the summer of 1776, everyone around him understood he was dying. What almost nobody understood was that his vote might be the only thing standing between independence and failure. Delaware's delegation was deadlocked. One delegate wanted independence, one was firmly against it. And without Rodney, there was no way to break the tie. The problem was that Rodney wasn't even in Philadelphia. He was 80 miles away, at home, managing a militia uprising and losing a battle against his own body at the same time. A writer reached him with an urgent message. Come now, or Delaware's vote is lost. Rodney got on his horse in the middle of a thunderstorm, at night, sick, exhausted, and in visible pain, and rode through the dark for 80 miles straight. He didn't stop to rest. He didn't stop to treat himself. He rode directly into Philadelphia, still covered in mud from the storm. and walked into the State House still wearing his riding boots, just in time to cast the deciding vote for Delaware. Independence passed because a dying man refused to let his own death get there before he did. Rodney lived 8 more years after that ride, watching the country he helped create take its first steps before the cancer finally caught up with him. He never got treatment that could have saved him. There wasn't any. He just kept living and working with a green scarf on his face until his body couldn't do it anymore. Even a president wasn't safe from the era's medicine. Sometimes the doctors were the most dangerous thing in the room. George Washington had survived smallpox, malaria, and multiple close calls on actual battlefields. He was 67 years old, retired, living quietly at Mount Vernon, generally considered one of the toughest men in the country. On December 12, 1799, he rode out on his usual inspection of the farm in freezing rain and snow. He came back cold and wet, but he didn't think much of it. By the next morning, he had a sore throat and was struggling to breathe. Doctors were called immediately. 3 of them, some of the most respected physicians in the country. This should have given him the best possible chance. Instead, they bled him repeatedly. Bloodletting was considered standard medical practice at the time, the belief being that illness came from an excess of blood that needed to be drained out of the body. Over the course of about 12 hours, Washington's doctors drained somewhere between 5 and 9 pints of blood from his body. A healthy adult male has around 10 to 12 pints total. They took almost half of everything he had. Between the bleeding, the throat infection restricting his airway, and treatments that included forcing him to inhale vinegar and hot water, Washington's condition didn't improve. It collapsed. By that evening, barely able to speak, he reportedly told his doctors to stop, that they were only hastening his death. They didn't listen in time. He died before midnight, less than 24 hours after riding out into the cold that morning. Modern doctors looking back at the case generally agree Washington likely had a bacterial throat infection, something treatable today with basic antibiotics. He almost certainly would have survived it. What killed him wasn't the illness. It was losing nearly half his blood in the name of curing it. The most powerful man in America died because the best medical care available to him in 1799 was actively working against his own body, and somehow the strangest deaths in this entire story were still waiting on one specific date. You already know the ending of this one. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, 2 men who signed the Declaration of Independence together, who became friends, then bitter political enemies, then friends again in their final years through decades of letters, both died on July 4, 1826. Exactly 50 years to the day after the Declaration was adopted. But here's the part that actually gets left out. Adams was 90 years old, fading in and out of consciousness in his home in Massachusetts. His last words, spoken that afternoon, were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He believed his old friend and rival was still alive somewhere, still holding on, maybe even outliving him one more time the way their whole rivalry had always gone back and forth. He had no way of knowing that Jefferson, 400 miles away in Virginia, had already died that same morning. Jefferson himself had spent his final days asking the people around him what day it was, apparently holding on specifically until the 4th arrived. He got his wish. He died just after noon. Adams followed a few hours later that same afternoon, convinced right up until his last breath that his friend was still out there, still alive. 2 of the men most responsible for that document, dying on its 50th anniversary, hours apart, each one unaware the other was already gone. If that happened once in fiction, nobody would believe it. It happened twice. 5 years later, in 1831, James Monroe, the 5th President of the United States and another founding-era figure, also died on July 4th. 3 of America's first 5 presidents, gone on the exact same date, decades apart from each other, with no medical or logical explanation connecting any of it. Historians still don't have a real answer for why. Some call it coincidence. Some call it something closer to willpower. Men who spent their entire lives fighting to reach a symbolic date and simply refused to let go before they got there. Whatever it was, it only leaves one man from that room still standing, watching everyone else's story end before his own. 3 presidents, 1 date, no real explanation, but someone was still alive to watch every single one of these stories end. Charles Carroll of Carrollton was the youngest signer of the Declaration of Independence, and by the time he actually died, he was the very last one left alive. Not the last one from a small group of close friends. The last human being on Earth who had personally signed that document. He watched all 55 of the other signers die before him. He watched Hamilton fall in a duel. He watched Wythe get poisoned by his own family. He watched Rodney ride through a storm dying of cancer, and watched him pass away years later anyway. He watched Adams and Jefferson die on the same impossible date, 50 years after they had all stood together and risked everything. Every single death you just heard about, Carroll was alive to witness. He outlived John Adams by 6 years. He outlived Thomas Jefferson by 6 years as well. By the time he finally died in 1832 at 95 years old, he had carried the entire weight of that room by himself for years. The only man left who could say he had actually been there when it happened. When Carroll died, an entire era of American history closed with him. Every man who had signed his name to a piece of paper that could have gotten him executed for treason was finally gone. 56 signatures, 56 different endings, duels, poison, disappearance at sea, bankruptcy, disease, a storm in the middle of the night, and one impossible, unexplainable date that took 3 of them. They knew the risk when they signed. None of them knew exactly how the story would end for them individually. Now you do. If you want more stories like this, the ones history quietly left out, subscribe. There's a lot more nobody ever tells you.